Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. As relations between India and China remain tense, a few preliminary salvos have been fired from the economic front. Is it enough, and who stands to lose in this economic face-off between India and China? Also, what's the larger strategy picture here? Joining me to talk about all of that is former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran. He is also one of the most insightful voices on foreign policy, diplomacy, and indeed economic relations. Thank you, Mr. Saran, for joining in and speaking with me. I want to start first by setting a sort of structural framework and a foreign policy framework to our conversation before we get to the economic implication of India and China's situation right now. At this point, sir, how would you describe the situation as it stands between India and China from a security or a foreign policy point of view?
I think it would be fair to say that the assumptions on which we were taking India-China relations forward for the last several decades, in a sense, there was a basic kind of a understanding and consensus between the two sides that yes, we have issues such as the border, but there are also areas of convergence between the two sides. And that those areas of convergence, in a sense, obliged us to be able to get away from some of those contentious issues and to work positively together in pursuit of those common interests. So it was not that we somehow ignored the points of differences, but there was a certain frame within which those differences were being handled. What I think Prime Minister Modi tried to put across that we should try to ensure that differences don't become disputes. Now, what has happened now is those differences have become disputes. So that old sort of framework within which we were pursuing India-China relations, I am afraid the assumptions behind that framework are no longer very relevant. So we have to find a new set of assumptions, perhaps a new kind of consensus on the basis of which we can manage the India-China relationship. That is how I see it. And it will be a difficult exercise. Difficult because there is a asymmetry of power between the two sides, which is in fact expanding.
Yeah.
The Chinese never never shy away from telling us that we are 5 times your size. How can it be the same as it was 20 years ago? That we have a expanded set of interests. And in a sense, you have to accept that China has a certain new kind of a approach, new perspective within which it is looking at the world from its side. And if it does not sort of align with some of your interests, well, bad luck in a sense. Yeah.
You also wrote earlier this month that if Indian troops have to withdraw from areas on our side, we would have acquiesced in the Chinese 2 steps forward, 1 step back, tried and tested playbook. Along with China playing the aggressor, would you say India is at this point on the back foot?
Well, to the extent that we have a very highly trained, motivated, Indian armed forces, I have no doubt that they are in a position to and quite capable of holding the line as far as China is concerned. So I do not see the prospect of very major territorial gains being made by China at the points of friction. But when you have a situation where in what is really a very sparsely populated, wide open spaces, yes, if you are not very alert, there can be by a determined adversary, there can be a push against what we say our line of actual control is. Now, stopping them from making further inroads is possible and it's eminently doable. Throwing them out of areas that they have already occupied, that's a more difficult proposition. because precisely for the reason that I mentioned, that the risk of escalation is quite high. The asymmetry in terms of the quality of infrastructure on our side, the infrastructure on their side, the fact that they have mobilized fairly large forces in the rear areas, to which we have, of course, also responded. So any exercise to try and physically push them out from areas which they may have occupied, that is a much more difficult proposition.
As you mentioned, sir, and as you have mentioned in your previous interviews as well, this is a role that traditionally China has wanted to have. It wants to be the dominant force in Asia. It's not looking for 2 or 3, 4 player game. It wants to be the supreme sort of leader within this region. How deep would you say the damage has been to Sino-Indian ties this time round? And how long is your own estimate, as a seasoned watcher of this situation, on when any reparation can begin between the two nations?
Well, I don't see how some kind of a resumption of the old sort of basis of the India-China relationship can be, in a sense, revived. So going forward, we have to accept, as I mentioned earlier, that the assumptions on which we so far pursued our relationship with China, those assumptions are perhaps changed. So what may happen in the future? As you said, yes, I have pointed out that, you see, China looks at power relations in a very hierarchical fashion. It's a kind of a cultural attribute, I would say, that China's view is that harmony and peace is only possible, can only be maintained if there is a clear hierarchy of power and various players in that hierarchy know their place. And there has to be someone, at the top who makes sure that that hierarchy stays in place. And others accept the logic of that hierarchy and do not, try to upset that harmony. So in that context, what they are looking at in the Asian region is that this is a region where traditionally also China has been the most dominant power. And what is happening today is nothing more than China going back to what it has been its natural sort of position in history. And there is no room, if we want a peaceful and a stable kind of an order in Asia, we cannot have, a cluster of major powers trying to set up some kind of a multipolar, multilateral kind of a structure. You need a hierarchical system. And therefore, China's dominance is something that needs to be acknowledged by the others, has to be respected by the others. Now, in that context, if there is one country which, in terms of its size, in terms of its sense of itself as a civilizational entity, not just a mere country, a country which has immense economic potential, even if it has not quite realized it at the moment, it is as populous as China is. It has very, significant science and technological capabilities that it has demonstrated. If there is one country in the region which is, in a sense, a rival to that China's hierarchical order, it is only India. So there is also a sense that before, this country starts, getting too big for its boots, it has to be shown its place. So this psychology is fairly ingrained in the manner in which Chinese leadership, in the manner in which their foreign policy establishment looks at India and looks at this region.
Let me ask you, sir, then to pick up this psychology and mindset and place it on the economic chessboard, where a few sort of moves have been made by the Indian side, whether it was in terms of FDI policy changes or more recently with the app bans. Do you think that is sufficient to have caused any dent on the Chinese side? And B, what would you foresee coming in the next couple of months on the economic engagement front?
If I was sitting in Beijing, I would not bother too much. Because, the India-China trade is roughly about what? 2% or 2.5% of China's total humongous, trade volume. We are talking about a trade volume for China, which is more than India's GDP. That is what the difference is. So if I was sitting in Beijing, I would not worry too much. I may be irritated with what India may have done, but I don't think that it would, sort of persuade me to rethink my policy towards India. There are perhaps only a couple of cases where there may be some dent in terms of China's economic and commercial interests. Yes, of course, if you are looking at, say, some of the apps which have been banned, particularly TikTok, which has been the fastest expanding market for ByteDance in the world. That, yes, could be seen as a dent in China's commercial interest. Going forward, I think China was certainly looking at India as perhaps one of the more significant platforms for Huawei's 5G. Yeah. Particularly because most of the 3G, 4G network in India has essentially been built by Huawei, because it has always been very competitive. So it was almost like a natural progression going up to the upgradation to 5G. Now, if for political reasons we say no to 5G from Huawei, that not immediately, but going forward, that could be a dent, because this is one of the largest market you've seen. How big a market this is for Chinese mobile telephone companies. Today 80% of the mobile sold in India are Chinese.
Yes.
And also in some other areas, like if you take APIs, for example, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, you'd be amazed how heavy the dependence is. Something like 80% of the APIs are all sourced from China. Now, even if you find domestic alternatives to this, and yes, we were making APIs ourselves before, why did we shift to Chinese APIs? Because they were competitive. So there will be a certain price to pay when you are making that shift to alternatives. So in a sense, we have to be a little careful that in order to sort of give a certain signal to the Chinese, we don't end up hurting ourselves. Because the reality is that in some sectors, we are very heavily dependent upon China. Take, for example, lithium batteries. Virtually your entire, electronic sector is dependent upon lithium batteries, which we source from China. Or magnets, for example, virtually total dependence on China. Yeah. Now, we should not have allowed ourselves to become so overly dependent, but now that we are, when we try to make a shift, we should try and do it in a manner that does not end up by grievously hurting Indian industry itself. That is something important. Now, how do we orchestrate this? This, of course, the government has to try and work out in consultation with industry. It will have to handhold industry in order to make that shift, because it is not something that companies will be able to take on without some degree of support from the government, at least in the initial stages. Yeah. Now, have we worked out that strategy? I'm not very sure.
Let me actually flip that round and ask you to delve deeper on that point, Mr. Sarin. There is an anonymous comment from a Chinese official saying an economic dispute with China was farcical because there were no Indian goods that the Chinese could boycott. And I think that really underlines, the point that you were making. How much damage could we be inflicting on ourselves by trying to play, this economic tit for tat with China, you think?
So that's what I just said, that our dependence upon China, particularly in some very key sectors, As I mentioned, the telecommunication sector, or for example, the pharmaceutical sector, the electronic sector. A lot of the semiconductor, for example, are again sourced from China. So even though we may wish to shift away from that dependence, that will take time. It cannot happen overnight. And if you try to do it overnight, there will be heavy disruptions, particularly at a time when, thanks to the COVID pandemic, we are already in a somewhat difficult situation. Yes, even though that remark may have been made in jest, it is a reflection of a Chinese awareness that the dependence is more on our side, much less on their side. That is just the reality that we have to accept.
Would you say it seems quite an eventuality, a likely eventuality, that there will be a rethink in terms of tech and telecom policy? As you mentioned, for Huawei, the UK has moved already, and it seems like the US is pushing hard on this particular subject. Does it look like India is going to take that tack as well?
Well, if we are looking at the global situation, let me say that yes, to some extent, decoupling is taking place between Western economies, the US economy, and the Chinese economy. But let us not over sort of exaggerate. Why? Because the decoupling is so far limited only to some of the high-tech areas. It has not gone down the sort of line in terms of the very, very dense kind of a trade and investment relationship that exists between, say, the US and China. But when it comes to high technology, where the US feels that its competitiveness is under threat, its dominance in the technology sector is under threat, yes, there is a certain kind of decoupling taking place, and I think that will proceed even further. So it is essentially in the high-tech area that this kind of decoupling may be seen, and Huawei 5G is a very good example of that. Or, for example, in terms of semiconductors. You see, even though the US is not a major producer of semiconductors, but the machines which are required to make some of the most advanced semiconductors, those machines are American. Now, it will take time for China to actually develop those machines themselves, or to look for alternatives. So it is in those critical areas, very selectively, that that process of decoupling is taking place. But my sense is that when you go down the line, that's not really what is happening. And a recent survey was made of the American companies, major American companies who are already in China and who are heavy investors in the Chinese market and the Chinese economy. You would be surprised that more than 90% said that they had no plans to reshore their facilities to either the Southeast Asian countries or to back to the United States itself. What is the shift which is taking place? You see, the shift has been taking place for the last nearly 5 years, where as a result of higher wage costs and the fact that, China itself is moving up the value chain, there are industries and sectors where it makes sense for those production units to be moved out to more competitive locations. Even Chinese companies themselves are doing that. That is, they are shifting their own units to places like, Vietnam, or to Cambodia, or to Indonesia, because it is within the economic logic itself.
Yeah.
But here, when we are hearing talk about reshoring, or you are hearing talk about, shifting of the global supply chains, again, I would say we should be a little careful that we don't exaggerate that shift. Okay. So this is something that somehow we have got ourselves into a mindset that, there is a big rush out of China, and, let us position ourselves to take advantage of that shift. Not so simple.
What are our options at this point, though, Mr. Sarin? I mean, should India relook the RCEP agreement? Is that a conversation that should come back to the table?
Well, I have argued right from the beginning that we should be in the RCEP.
Yeah.
I have always held that it is better to be inside the tent and actually influence the way the regional trade agreement, evolves, rather than to say, sorry, I throw up my hands and I will have nothing to do with you. Because that's the surest way of pushing yourself to the margin of the regional economy, to the margin of the global economy. Now, somehow, there is a sense in our country, and even amongst decision makers, that external trade is still a matter of tariffs. We are still, our whole focus is, tariffs. Tariffs are not the name of the game today. What is the kernel of negotiations which are taking place in various kind of fora? It is about standards. It is about norms. It is about public procurement. It is about what kind of regulatory regime you would have. These are the kind of things that are being talked about, mostly non-tariff. Tariff is a very small part of this game, because most countries have brought their tariffs down to 5% or even 4%. So that is not where the competitive element plays out. The competitive element plays out through these non-tariff factors. And somehow we have not understood that the nature of the game has very much changed. So if we do not take that into account, and we continue to sort of distance ourselves from these trading arrangements, then it is almost inevitable that you might end up with a high cost, low quality economy. That is not what where you want to go.
When one looks at this situation, Mr. Saran, taking 3 steps back, it looks like a series of false steps, whether it was with regards to our foreign policy reaction, our defense reaction, of course, just in the thick of the event, and now in terms of the very timid moves that are happening in terms of an economic disengagement. What would you say are the 3 or 4 things to be mindful of at this point while taking on an adversary like China, while trying to redraw the games, the line of the game, when you know that you are indeed the weaker player?
So if you are the weaker player, where the first order of business is, how do I make myself strong again? Isn't it?
Yes.
If the asymmetry of power is the real reason why we find ourselves in the kind of predicament that we are in, then all the more reason that your attention should be focused and your leadership should be focused on how do I get India back to a high growth path. The potential of this economy is to be able to grow at 8 to 9% per annum, which we have done in the past. You actually have the potential to go beyond, in fact, single digits, if you adopted the right kind of policies, if you adopted the right kind of economic measures. Once you start growing like that, I'll give you the example of 2003 to 2007. Part of the time I was foreign secretary. Now, it is not that at that time there was not a asymmetry of power between India and China. Of course there was. Maybe not as much as it is today, but there was. But what is the difference? The difference was that at the same time that China's economy was slowing down, the Indian economy was growing much faster. That was the period when we were growing at the rate of 8 to 9% per annum. That was the time when, the whole notion of BRICS came up. Or, that was the time when people were saying, India is probably going to be the next China in terms of commercial opportunity. That this is the country which, is actually, in terms of power potential, is going to be the equal of China. Perhaps even go beyond China. That made all the difference in terms of opening up the diplomatic space for us. How did we get the India-US nuclear deal through? It was because of the international perception that here is a country which is actually, going to be the next big power. Now, you need to recapture that. Again, as I said, it's not that you have to first equal where China is in order to be able to change that environment. But you can by actually beginning to shrink that gap. which is eminently doable. I mean, it is not something that is beyond India's ken. But if you are looking at doing that through, for example, Atmanirbhar Bharat, a very fine idea, but a Atmanirbhar Bharat which translates into policies which actually ends up by taking you again back to low quality, high cost economy, I'm sorry, you have given up the game even before you have started playing it. Do you agree?
When you observe the situation, then candidly, Mr. Saran, are you filled with any confidence about it? What to your mind, and I know I'm pushing you to do some crystal gazing here, but what to your mind is going to be the likely flow of events over the next year, particularly on this very prickly equation?
Well, I have a optimism which is born out of experience. That when India has found itself in very deeply critical situations, and whatever be the reason why it has taken those decisions, it has ended up taking the right kind of decisions. I was in the Prime Minister's office in the very critical period of 1990 to 1992. Many people do not remember that period because actually the transition was made so smoothly. Soviet Union collapsed. Our strategic partnership with the Soviet Union came to evaporated virtually overnight. We were facing a balance of payments crisis. India was near bankruptcy. Nobody at that time would say that India has very, very good prospects going forward. And yet, within a couple of years, not only did we make that transition very smoothly, very skillfully, but then we also set the stage for India embarking on unprecedentedly high, growth rates. Adopted very difficult economic reforms. It is another matter that we did not take that forward as we should have, but at least I would say that very difficult political decisions were taken at that time. And the choices that we made at that time, difficult choices that we made, actually paid dividends for us in the future. So I'm looking at that experience, it appears to me that we are today, no doubt, in a very, very difficult crisis, almost an existential crisis, thanks to the pandemic, thanks to the fact that our economy is in such a bad shape. So maybe this is a time when the right kind of decisions could in fact be taken. After all, politically, you are very well placed. You have a government which has parliamentary majority. You have a leadership which is very strong and decisive. Well, if you are strong and decisive, then take the right kind of decisions. I mean, this Prime Minister has shown himself to be ready to take some political risk. Some of those political risks maybe you and I would not have liked him to take. But the fact is that, he has a certain room for taking difficult decisions, which perhaps another Prime Minister without that kind of a political support may not have been able to. So there is still room for optimism. But if only India does not make the mistake of trying to, just as it is happening in some of the other economies, that there is a stalling of globalization, there is a deep questioning of globalization, there is even a retreat from globalization. We should not be, sort of falling into that trap. Globalization, believe me, is here to stay. And those who remain ahead of the curve of globalization are going to be the winners tomorrow. Not those who say, sorry, it is too difficult and I'll put walls around myself and stay safe. If you do that, then obviously you're not going to make the grade.
My final question then to you, Mr. Saran, and I don't mean to sound gloomy, but what would the cost of a misstep be, both in terms of a foreign policy outcome for us with India-China relations, as also on the economic front? Because as you pointed out, it's not just the raw material, it's the amount of money that's come into startups, that's come into larger companies. China is well entrenched in our economy.
Well, I'm not so worried about the entrenchment of the Chinese economy, in our economy, because frankly, that scale is still quite small. I mean, I know that China is a very big player in the digital space. Yeah. And frankly, I have been somewhat worried about how much dominant China has been in that digital space. So in some sense, being able to somehow have a more diverse kind of a composition in terms of foreign players is to India's interest, I would say. But much more important is to really have a very, very clear idea in terms of our economic strategy. For example, I see contradictions if we say Atmanirbhar Bharat, or if we say that we want to create a more congenial kind of an environment for our own industries to grow, then I see no reason why you should be wedded to a strong rupee policy. It's almost as if there is a political symbolism which is involved there, that a strong rupee means a strong government. I think you have to rethink that. If really you want to be a more dynamic export economy, it's better to do that rather than to give sops to this sector or that sector selectively. It is much better that you have a level playing field for everyone. Secondly, there has to be a recognition that some of the aims and objectives that we have put forward, that we want to be part of global supply chains, that we want to make sure that, in the next order of the shifting of supply chains, India is in the picture. To have that, you need to have, an import policy which allows competitive components to be able to come to India. If you have high import duties, then how are you going to, run those global supply chains? Thirdly, I think we also have to recognize that in order to be globally competitive, if Atmanirbhar Bharat means that I want to create a globally competitive economy, then the first order of business is to improve your infrastructure, to completely overhaul your regulatory regime, completely rethink your taxation policy. You cannot have retrospective taxation. You have to have predictable policy. So it is a whole mix of reforms that you need in order to be globally competitive. Merely by saying that, it is not going to happen. So it is not something which will happen overnight, but are you clear in your mind that these contradictions that you have introduced, on the one hand, you are saying, I welcome foreign investment. Now, if you welcome foreign investment in an economy which has high tariff walls, what incentive is there for the foreign partner to bring in the best technology to the country, make the best products? There won't be. If he can sell, substandard goods and he can bring, outdated technology, why not? So we should not fall into that kind of a trap. That on the one hand, we are saying, welcome foreign investment. On the other hand, we are saying, no, we should have protective walls around. My sense is that there are many contradictions of this kind in what seems to be coming out as policy pronouncements from the government. So is there a effort to try and look at these various components of our economic strategy and try to make certain that there is a certain coherence, so that the message which goes out also, message to our own business and message to foreign business, that yes, this is even if it is not going to yield results immediately, there is good reason for us to put in long-term stakes. I think that is what we should be looking at.
All very cogent points, Mr. Saran. I hope the people who are working on policy are listening, because it's sorely needed at this point. I don't need to remind you that the economic distress we've been feeling was much longer than the pandemic. So we have a long road to recovery. But thank you so much for joining in today. I really appreciate your
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.